Did you know that Africa is home to nearly half of the world's gold and one-third of its minerals? For the last few centuries, the pendulum of power has swung towards the Mediterranean powers. Western Europe and North America may have taken the lead in the colonial era, followed by the current US-China duality, but these dynamics came at the cost of the old ones. The rise of Europe after the Middle Ages can be attributed to the reallocation of wealth. The Industrial Revolution did help usher humanity into a new era, but the focus seldom shifts to its demerits. Lost in its positives are the harrowing tales of humanity, those brutalized, trodden upon, and vandalized. Colonialism and the Industrial Revolution were not two isolated phenomena. They were intertwined beasts that worked in tandem. As one often comes across the advances of these two phases in history, let us take a look on the other side of the curtain, where slaves were sold and bought like toys. Let us take a look at the lives of slaves as they were moved from Africa to North America, and then when they worked in the latter. After the fall of Rome, Africa was considered far more advanced than its European counterparts. The fall of Africa, which is probably the worst case of exploitation in the annals of history, can be credited to many different things, including but not restricted to the rise in slavery and the rampant tragedy of colonialism. After the French Revolution and similar movements throughout Europe and its colonies, people began to be more aware of the horrors of slavery. In 1794, France declared that slavery was abolished in all of its colonies. This, however, was reverted in 1802 by Napoleon Bonaparte. 2 years later, the Haitian Revolution took place, and Haiti became the first country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. Although the ideas of abolition had been present for a while, the deplorable conditions of what Africans went through cannot be overstated. As humans were transported from the African continent to the Americas, no thought was given to the conditions in which they were shipped. The traders on either side had no regard for the lives of the cargo. The lives of those on board, or those left behind, were deemed practically useless. The trading was lucrative enough to look the other way. Europeans relied on raids to manage their trade effectively because they were afraid to venture too far into the African continent. Illness was their first fear, but they were also worried about African resistance. Later, some of the raiders learned what happened to the slaves they sold to Europeans, and they ceased trading with them. Others were like the current poachers who plagued the continent. They did not care how the slaves were treated once they were no longer in their care. The fact that the slavers would hold the families of African traders hostage while waiting for the delivery of new slaves was an incentive for some to continue. But it also helped to establish the reputation that would later cause Europeans to find it far more difficult to acquire slaves through help from Africans. In North America and the Caribbean, people realized that the land was incredibly fertile. European immigrants understood that they could get away with unpaid labor, so slavery became the norm. The highest concentration of slaves existed in the farming industries in the southern colonies of North America, although there were slaves in the north as well, Brazil, and the Caribbean islands. Europeans had some semblance of a common culture to refer back to, which unified them in a way. Most, although not all, harbored a disdain for Africans and Native Americans, but since neither Africans nor the indigenous people were bounded by European ideals, they were far kinder towards each other. We know that the indigenous people were relatively hospitable towards Africans, since they disagreed with the inherent logic that fueled the idea of owning people. The areas with the most fertile ground and ideal environment for crops were also those with the hottest climate and most affected by insects and disease. While this was not as severe in the southern areas of North America as it was in the Caribbean, it still resulted in slaves dying from heat exhaustion and inhumane environments. In the early days, the only incentive to treat slaves better was so slave owners would not have to spend as much money to replace them. In places like Saint Domingue and Hispaniola, the modern-day countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, a large percentage of both slaves and colonists died from diseases such as yellow fever. In these regions, slaves were forced to work as much as possible under the assumption that slaves would not make it past the first year. Slave owners in the American colonies treated and fed their slaves a certain way in an attempt to permit them to live longer. Slaves were viewed as property, and slave owners worked their slaves less so they would last longer, including any children they would have. The different perspectives on slavery meant the overall experience of slaves varied based on their life expectancy. Slaves who were likely to increase a slaveholder's labor force would be treated slightly better than those who weren't expected to live a year. In the United States, by 1850, almost 3 million slaves lived in rural areas, whereas almost 400,000 slaves lived in urban areas. In Charleston, South Carolina, there were almost 40,000 slaves in 1860, which constituted almost one-third of the city's entire population. On most plantations, life was an excruciating and grueling ordeal. At dawn, slaves would have to start work, laboring until nightfall, taking minor breaks for breakfast and lunch. Weekly food rations would be issued in the form of cornmeal, lard, molasses, peas, greens, flour, and a little bit of meat. While they were consumed during the breaks in the day, they were usually prepared in a cookhouse. For the most part, the slaves were not given enough to eat, so some stole from their masters. Getting caught meant enduring a harsh and stern punishment. Slaves rarely had a lot of clothes. As they worked tirelessly under the scorching sun all day, they would sweat and bleed in their clothes. Unfortunately, clothes were only given once a year, usually around Christmas. Since life expectancy was a big deal in terms of net revenue, older slaves were not given the extra layers of clothing in winter that the young slaves were given. Often, young people would give their rations or clothing to the older ones, but that would prompt another beating, as there were always informers in the servant cabins. These slaves relayed information up the chain of command in hopes of better treatment. Slaves of richer landlords usually resided in a separate building that served as a servant quarters. This building would often stand behind the owner's dwelling. After working on the farms, the slaves still had chores to do. In the Caribbean, slaves often ended up working up to 18 hours, and to ensure higher output, they were flogged with whips whenever their work rate declined. They would labor entire days, clearing land, planting seeds, and harvesting crops. For the most part, the slaves did not receive payment or restitution of any kind. This rendered them invalid when it came to financial independence. Since they were not earning any money, they could not possibly free themselves and their families from the pangs of slavery. At best, they could hope for a pitiful and kind person to buy them out. The few lucky slaves who earned their way out of slavery generally did so when they were hired out. Hiring out was a practice in which one slave owner gave his or her slave to another. This other slave owner was refrained from harming the property that was loaned to him or her. The slave owner who had received the slave on loan would pay a small fee, sometimes to the actual owner, other times to the laborer. House slaves worked up to 20 hours a day, cooking, cleaning, driving, basically doing any household chores deemed important by their masters. All this was possible due to the gang labor system in which large groups of slaves worked under the direct supervision of a boss. Slave owners were literal owners, so for the most part, they could not be persecuted for mistreatment. Slaves had no legal standing, so they could neither defend themselves from the violent attacks of their Caucasian masters nor in courts during trials. Those who were not farmhands worked as house servants. Males mostly worked on the farms, whereas ladies served as midwives, farm workers, and in-house servants. Girls would start working as early as the age of 4. Teenage girls often worked on the farms or performed domestic duties. Women older than that would be housekeepers and midwives. Since women were not considered as much of a threat as men, they were often allowed in homes. This gave them access to books that helped them learn to read and write. It is a testament to the fortitude of African slaves that they not only endured unspeakable hardships, but pushed back. In terms of literature, art, and music, African women were responsible for changing the opinion of slaves and free men. While changing the minds of free men is understandable, one should realize that born into such cultural, sociological, and ideological restraints, the slaves were accustomed to an overwhelming sense of inferiority. Slaves were rarely educated, and as such, they understood little beyond their daily chores. They often recorded their experiences by singing songs that were seldom written down on the spot. The southern colonies had passed legislation against the education of slaves, except for Christian teachings. By 1860, less than 8% of all people of African descent in the United States were literate. Not only did this severely limit their ability to learn and manage money, but it also hampered the creation of African American literature and art in the period leading up to the Civil War. Fortunately, they were adept at recreating stories through their songs. A few slaves and free men have left their cultural mark, and ironically, it was largely through writing. Resistance towards the institute of slavery materialized in everyday life instead of assembled revolts or rebellions. The slaves had no rights, and it was next to impossible to organize among themselves. As such, their masters would beat sense into them. If that did not solve the issue, their masters would beat them to death. Another option was simply getting rid of excited slaves by selling them to an unknowing buyer. In the South, African Americans formed congregations with their preachers and performed religious services. This allowed for some form of organization. The slave culture in the South added Western African mythological aspects to Euro-American ideas of Christianity. The folk and gospel elements that continue to be part of church services was normalized by these congregations. While discussing slavery in the Americas, one must remember that slavery was not new to history. It had been prevalent in ancient cultures for a long time. However, it had been rarely exploited in such a cruel fashion and to such dreaded ends. Historians have assumed a lot about the Egyptian slaves, contributing to false rhetoric that has continued well into the 21st century. For instance, according to common conspiracy theories that continue to persist, the pyramids were built by slaves. We now know this was not the case, and the Egyptians probably treated their slaves much better than we had been led to believe. The people that built the pyramids were most likely employed and paid well for their work. It is unlikely that slave labor resulted in any major structures still standing. Because of the Europeans' ill track record with slaves, one presumes that such treatment would extend to antiquity and beyond. If we look at how various African tribes treated their slaves upon the arrival of the Europeans, we realize that slaves were more like servants. Slaves were an important resource, even though slave traders saw it as a means to an end. As the traders lined their pockets, the transatlantic slave trade gained ground. This history of forced migration of African people had been a source of shame and unrest that has plagued North America for centuries. Each slave's experience was unique, but none could be considered right. Over time, the question of slavery would explode into war, sometimes between the slaves and the colonists, and sometimes between those of European descent and slave owners over ethical issues. The effects of the transatlantic slave trade are still being felt today as the countries in North America grapple with the dark institution that was a cornerstone to its development. As we look back at those dark hours of history, one must come to terms with the words of Abraham Lincoln: "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves." To learn more about what was life like for most slaves, check out our book, Black History, a captivating guide to African American history and the Haitian Revolution. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while they're still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.